Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitik Survey, created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard. The link is in the bio.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of your favorite All Things Policy, Takshashila Institution's flagship daily public policy podcast. I'm your host for the day, Amit Kumar, staff research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. In today's episode, we're going to talk about our favorite topic. Yes, you're right. It's the India-China relationship, something that our listeners are quite interested in. In the past 1 month or so, we have had a series of developments on this front, starting with the announcement by India's Ministry of External Affairs regarding a deal or understanding of sorts reached between the two sides, that is, India and China, on the disengagement in the Depsang and Demchok region. As our listeners would recall, of the 7 friction points that saw the troops from the two sides engage in an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation for over 4 years, even leading to clashes in Galwan, 5 had seen disengagement. Galwan, Pangangso, both North and South Bank, Gogra and Hot Springs were the regions. But Depsang and Demchok had appeared rather tricky to achieve disengagement on. And the reason that we were told was that Chinese were non-committal on agreeing to take the negotiations forward on these two regions, terming it a legacy issue predating 2020 standoff. And we had imagined, at least I had, that this issue may not see a proper resolution in the coming times. But kudos to the government that the disengagement has now been achieved on these areas as well. To discuss this matter further, I have with me my colleague, Anushka Saxena, staff research analyst at the China desk of the Indo-Pacific team. Welcome, Anushka.
Thank you so much, Amit. Happy to be here.
Of course, Anushka. So tell me, Anushka, did you expect this breakthrough? Because I clearly did not. Tell us very briefly as to what are the details in this deal that has been achieved between two countries. And very quickly, if you could also throw some light on what could be the possible reasons for this thaw that we have now witnessed in the relations.
Right. Thank you so much for these very interesting questions, Amit. And very broadly, this deal or arrangement, what it entails is that, firstly, as you rightly mentioned, disengagement on the 5 conventional friction points had already been achieved till maybe around September 2022. And since then, the deliberations and negotiations during various roundtables and in meetings of various mechanisms focused on disengagement in Depsang and Demchok. And some of these mechanisms, I'm sure our listeners would be familiar with. One is the working mechanism on the border, or the WMCC, and another is the SHMC, or the senior high-level military commanders talks, which we colloquially understand as the core commander level talks. So across the 21 rounds of the core commander level talks, especially in many towards the end, Depsang and Demchok was something India was continually pushing for, especially after September 2022. And now on October 21, we have seen that the Chinese have ceded India the rights to resume patrolling to the pre-January 2020 levels in the Depsang plains and Demchok regions. And in Depsang in particular, I think it was an issue of access to patrolling points 11, 12, 13 beyond the Y junction, closer to the LAC. And now we see that as of October 29, that indeed seems to have come true, as the Chinese have backed off and structures have dismantled. Other than that, I think one of the other issues that was pushed for in negotiations over Depsang and Demchok was that of the resumption of grazing that was undertaken by civilians in the region. And I think that too is now going to see a revival, given that disengagement indeed seems to have come true, although this arrangement wasn't really about de-escalation and de-induction, which we could talk about later in the episode. And quickly, as to the question of what the possible reason for this thaw, so to say, could be, there's been a lot of writing and speculation on this front as well. And I think a most popular theory, which I really wish is true and want to relate to, is that, this is the two sides, India and China, preparing for Trump 2.0. The uncertainty that comes with the Trump White House for the next 4 years could mean anything for not just China, which has now been recognized as a systemic rival of the US, but also for India. And we're already seeing some of these issues like the H-1B visa and India circumventing sanctions on oil trade with Iran, so on and so forth, coming up in Trump's rhetoric, right? So if that was indeed the push that kicked the Chinese off of the verge, so to say, then maybe the next 4 years, and this may be hopeless optimism, but maybe the next 4 years could spell betterment, at least in negotiating and pushing through for things on the border. And I think one of the other things is also that if you look at the narratives, Chinese President Xi Jinping pushes out on a regular basis these days. A crucial component of that is the recognition that China now exists in an extremely hostile external environment, given that since 2016-17, its foreign policy has taken as we call it, wolf warrior turn, and that has alienated a bunch of nations, both in China's neighborhood and beyond. And this is not to say that China suddenly, came to its senses and wanted to have one less enemy, so to say. But I'd also want to believe that this was a cherry on top, in addition to the other factors that may have pushed the Chinese to finally concede and bring about some semblance of stability in the relationship.
Absolutely, I agree. A couple of observations, though. One, that this disengagement, that understanding that we have, or the agreement. Of course, the Indian side has called it an agreement, but there have been certain section in the Indian experts have called it that the Chinese have not called it an agreement. I don't see much value in that argument, because this essentially the agreements have already been in place. This was rather an understanding after a round of encroachments that happened, and therefore this was an understanding. What the experts, especially Ashok Kanta, who pointed this out, meant to say that maybe there's no legal backing to it. But I guess we don't require that, because the agreements that were concluded in the previous decades still stand. They have not been sidestepped. They still do. I don't really see quite relevance in this argument that the Chinese side have not called it an agreement. Uh, anyway, coming to the Depsang question, I think this is a big achievement for India, because if I remember correctly, Indian petrols had been having problems accessing the petroling points since 2013 and not 2020. And therefore, the Chinese were in a way right to call it pre-legacy issues from predating 2020. And every time Indian petrols would march up to the petroling points, they would be interrupted at the Y junction, the birthday. And this is important because we could not keep an eye on what the developments that were on the Chinese sides. And given the strategic significance of the DBO road that India has, which runs very adjacent to that region, I think that was a very strategic vulnerability that we were forced upon. And I think resumption of patrolling rights, in at least in Depsang and Demchok, Depsang especially is very strategic and a very major strategic win for India. Uh, and coming on to your Trump point, I think I clearly agree, because so far it was actually the Indians who were making all the effort to resolve this issue. But the resistance that we saw were from the Chinese sides, and they were not kind of very keen on resolving these issues. And therefore, I think, and something that changed was, I think, and I agree with you, was the Trump presidency and the expectation that the Trump would come back to power. And given the animosity and the kind of external environment that China was operating in, it perhaps thought it was better to resolve this issue with India, and maybe have a new beginning. With that, I'd like to come on the second question that I have in my mind is India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, recently briefed the parliament about the deal in Depsang and Demchok. But as the news broke out, and this was actually very good, because in the past 4 years, I don't think the government has allowed a discussion on China in parliament and has briefed the opposition of the parliament on this issue. So it was a welcome beginning in that regard as well. But as this news broke out, and as his statement was released and were further subsequently analyzed, several questions were raised. Of course, the statement that was put out by MEA later, again after Jaishankar's remark in the parliament, further fueled some reservations by a certain section of the experts, strategic experts. If you could tell us what were those reservations or points of criticism that came about, and what do you make of it?
Right. Yeah, I think on the issue of briefing the parliament and inciting discussion, yeah, I do agree that in the past 4 years, it's been very, very rare and almost non existent, the idea that China could be discussed and the opposition could be heard in parliament. But I think, and there have been, I think, a couple briefings by the defense minister Rajnath Singh on the state of disengagement, maybe in the last 2 years. But yes, other than that, the foreign minister's briefing to both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha only happened recently on 3rd and 4th December, respectively. So yes, in that sense, this has been a positive development. Uh, and yes, I think just to first look at some of the key things that EM Jaishankar pointed out in his remarks, I think the first is that he clarified that the nature of India's China policy going forward is going to be unchanging, in that the restoration of peace and tranquility on the border is going to be the basis for the rest of the relationship
Right.
to move forward. So I think that's something, as a policy pillar, that's something India has held very close to its heart in the past 4 years. And the Chinese have advocated for business as usual, and that's something we've opposed. And I think that's going to be the state, even though contradictorily his remarks also had a lot of positive commitment to moving the relationship forward now that disengagement has been completed, which is a whole nother issue. But yes, he iterated that the October 21 agreement is the latest in a series of understandings in regard to the resolution of the situation at various friction points in eastern Ladakh. So he also acknowledges that in the past 4 years, these negotiations on disengagement have been understandings, and they'll be backed by the legal resolve that comes with previously concluded agreements, right? And he also talked about how the next step includes, in a calibrated manner and keeping national security front and center, taking other aspects of the relationship forward, right? So I think that was one thing that was very interesting to note. Given that I think his statement does give clarity that national security is going to precede economic logic going forward in the relationship with China. But at least with the disengagement process complete, the government is slightly altering its tone from not doing any business at
Right.
all to allowing some business because this breakthrough of sorts was achieved. That said, I think we should also take into account what other ministries and departments of the government have said. Finance Minister Sitaraman, for example, has been very resolute in arguing that, and I'm paraphrasing what she said sometime in the last few weeks. She said, I need to keep an eye out for where the money is coming from, right? So I think it's easier said than done that, just because disengagement is done, we'll see a greater flow of investments which have been capped very tightly. And that the decision to cap them, of course, also preceded the Galwan Valley conflict. It came with the Press Note 3 in early 2020. Other than that, I think one interesting thing that's ironic between what Jaishankar had to say in the parliament on 3rd December and then the statement of the WMCC meeting that came out on the 5th of December, and there was some dissonance in the arguments therein, where the WMCC readout on the Indian side, and this was the 32nd meeting of this working mechanism, there that readout said that in the coming days we kind of positively affirm that the implementation of this disengagement agreement has completed the resolution of issues that emerged in 2020.
Right.
And the fact that both Jaishankar statements, as well as in another line, the WMCC readout acknowledge that the next steps are supposed to be de-escalation and de-induction. The fact that the WMCC deemed it fair to say that issues that emerged in 2020 have been resolved seems, as I started off, a bit ironic and maybe not in tune with the discord that exists on various fronts in the public and private domains in India, right? And I think one final point that I want to talk about from Jaishankar's remarks is about the solutions that were being experimented, as he says, in different locations. So he said different locations have seen different solutions being examined, and the solutions he was referring to here to quote unquote diffuse the situation that emerged in the last 4 years was the creation of demilitarized zones, limited non-patrolling zones, relocation or withdrawal of posts, disengagement of troops, and dismantlement of structures. So I think now we know that the government has not given an official line on buffer zones and what their width has been, at least in some of the areas that news reportage has been telling us buffer zones have been created in, like Galwan, Gogra, and Pangong Lake. But the statement at least does seem to suggest that there have been a few areas where these so-called demilitarized zones or limited non-patrolling zones are being experimented with. So I think maybe in the course of a couple more years, we'll hear more from the government on acknowledgement of the creation of these buffer zones, but we should remember and keep in mind, and this is a statistic that came out a while ago, but still it's important to keep in mind, right, that because of the reported creation of these buffer zones, India lost access to nearly 26 out of 65 patrolling points in eastern Ladakh. And so the EAM statement was silent on this front, but let's see if we hear more once de-escalation, so to say, starts taking place.
Yeah, of course. I think for me, the major highlight that stood out, for me at least, was from Jaishankar's statement, was that while he talked about resumption of patrolling rights for India in Depsang and Demchok, he did not brief the parliament on what arrangement was achieved on the other friction points. And like it was a tacit admission sort of a thing when he said that other options were explored, but he did not specify which particular option was explored for which particular friction point. And I think in itself, the government not being clear and upcoming on these questions, as the reports have suggested, they have created buffer zones, and largely to India's disadvantage in these areas. And I would have actually liked Jaishankar to speak on what sort of arrangements were achieved in the other friction areas. And that, I think, for me, was the biggest highlight, that he shied away from answering that question.
Right.
And very quickly, when 2 days later, when the WMCC readout by MA was released, Jaishankar's remark gave me a sense, at least, that things were not resolved completely. But then again, WMCC readout claimed contrary to what Jaishankar wants us to believe. And the fact that WMCC readout said that the things have been resolved, the issues that arose in 2020 have been resolved. Is this the new normal? I mean, this is something that has been under scanner and a lot of discussion that what would be the new normal. And if our listeners would remember correctly, then the MEA, which initially started with the demand that we would like to have status quo ante restored, and something that the Indian Army still abides by. MEA has not gone and have not mentioned status quo ante for quite some time now. So my question to you is this the new normal that we have arrived at? Is this the new normal that we're looking at? Of course, de-escalation, de-induction will happen, but the fact that there was no discussion on the arrangement that were achieved at other friction points, and the fact that WMCC readout claimed that resolution has been achieved, is this the new normal that we're looking at?
Right. So I think the fact that there is dissonance in what Jaishankar said and what the WMCC readout talked about, I think is a big, I don't know, bureaucratic error.
Blunder.
Yeah, a blunder or a bureaucratic error. And that is if the government is even giving it serious thought, because as researchers, sometimes we tend to read into things, right? Because that's a lot of what we hear from the government. So at the outset, it seems to me like, this has been a mistake. And frankly, from these statements, I don't get a sense of what the new normal is. But what I do understand, and this is something that you just talked about, what I do understand from the fact that the government has refrained from iterating the phrase status quo ante during negotiations for a while, that suggests to me that we are willing to accept a situation where maybe the existence of buffer zones can continue a thaw or an equilibrium or a semblance of stability on the border. Now, this is not to say that, territorially we won't be forthcoming or pushy anymore. And I think the fact that we continue to have Depsang and Demchok, both because of their strategic positioning and because of the rights of our civilians in Indian territory, on the agenda for a long time, the fact that we did that expresses how we still take the issue of territory very seriously. But I think because it's been so long negotiating, the new normal is that the Indian side does not believe that it can go back to pre 2020 or status quo until levels. And in that sense, there may also be a dissonance of note between what the armed forces have to say and what the foreign ministry is advocating for. But regardless, I think the nature of the challenge going forward is how to retain what we've already settled on, I think, and how to de-induct troops, how to make sure that clashes don't happen again, and how to make sure that China sees through the agreements that were previously reached at. And this is what I think Jaishankar's remarks at the parliament were also about, right? He gave some 3 principles that are to be observed in all circumstances, which are that both sides should strictly respect and observe the LAC, neither should attempt to unilaterally alter the status quo, and agreements and understandings reached in the past must be fully abided by. So the fact that he's saying that neither should attempt to unilaterally alter the status quo means that what we've achieved now is going to be status quo for any agreements going forward.
Yeah, quite correct. One thing that I again noticed in this thing, and which has not so far not been dismissed by the government, was it that what talks about quid pro quo in this case, where the Chinese, of the fact that Chinese are being now allowed to patrol the region in Yangtze. Of course, the government has not confirmed or denied the reports. I mean, and this seems bizarre, kind of bizarre to me, that while despite Depsang and Demchok being the most difficult of the all the 7 friction points to arrive an arrangement on, here clearly India, I mean, as soon as the agreement was achieved, India got rights of patrolling rights in these areas. But in areas that were there where this engagement was achieved quite, comparatively quickly than in these two areas, be it in Galwan, Pangangso, or Kogra and Hot Spring. Then Galwan, the disengagement was achieved 4 years ago now, but their patrolling rights, the Chinese side or the Indian side did not deem it necessary or justified to resume the patrolling in these areas. But in a much strategic positions in areas such as Depsang, it was quickly agreed upon. So this kind of throws a question if there was actually a quid pro quo or something that India actually ceded here to get the patrolling rights in Depsang and Demchok. And if this is where the Yangtze story comes in. So what do you think about this? Is there any element of truth in this?
Okay, but before I answer that question, wouldn't you say the let's assume the reports are true. Wouldn't you say the existence of buffer zones is India giving something up? But here, what India was giving up was maybe potentially patrolling rights to the Chinese in Yangtze, where in the previous cases it was buffer zones and not that.
Yeah, exactly my point, right? So my point was that what was it that India gave that was so significant to the Chinese that the Chinese agreed to allow India the patrolling rights in Depsang and Demchok. Depsang clearly more strategic than other areas, but the same could not have been achieved in other friction areas such as Galwan or Pangangso.
Right. I think, yeah, that's a very interesting point that you make because given the fact that Depsang and Demchok were so long on the negotiating table, you can see why the Chinese were unwilling to budge and whatever. There were legacy issues predating 2020, and the Chinese consistently made the rhetorical case that whatever is under discussion today is about the 5 friction points that predominantly we see emerging in 2020. But I think beyond that, now that I think about it, with the arguments you've invoked, it could also be that Depsang is very strategically positioned and China did not want to give it away. Despite the existence of potential buffer zones in Depsang, the Chinese wouldn't have been satisfied. So, yes, it would indeed have to be something significant that India could offer as a quid pro quo or in return for the Chinese to finally cede this demand, in addition to the external pushes that we talked about just a little while ago, right? And some credible reportage from, and I know the story was first broken by the Hindu on 25th of October. So some credible reportage is quoting army sources and saying that by the end of October, the Chinese, in exchange for patrolling rights beyond Y Junction in Depsang, were going to be allowed to patrol as before in Yangtze, Arunachal Pradesh, and their patrols were not going to be blocked. So I think, and let's assume this is true, right? This is how understandings or agreements or deals are made. And if India was not going to cede the demand for a buffer zone because of the strategic nature of the proximity, this had to be it, right? And so I think, there could be an element of truth in this based on the corollary you've pointed out with the previous 5 friction points and Depsang and Demchok.
And these are merely educated guess based on what information we have in the public domain, based on credible reports. Of course, we'll never know unless the government itself comes out and dismisses or confirms these kind of reports. These are only what the researchers and other observers, strategic experts, would make out of, right? But thank you so much, Anushka. This was a fascinating discussion on the recent developments and like a breakdown of the recent developments and Jaishankar's statement and the WMCC report or the statement by MEA. Thank you so much for coming. And listeners, thank you for staying with us. If you like this episode, do tune in to other episodes of ATP. Thank you, Anushka.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.